So Camilla Parker Bowles just had her entire royal future locked away in a heavy black leather archival case. And the person who walked into the room to make that devastating reality absolutely final wasn't some dusty old constitutional lawyer or even King Charles himself, but rather Princess Anne, armed with legal documents that had Kate Middleton's name woven so deeply into their foundational clauses that it became instantaneously, chillingly clear to everyone present that this unprecedented confrontation was absolutely not about petty arguments over antique furniture, luxury floor plans, or domestic palace squabbles, but rather it was about ensuring with ruthless, ironclad legal precision that one woman's lifelong ambition could never, ever be permitted to displace, threaten, or undermine the direct biological line of succession. Once you truly understand the deeply hidden, fiercely guarded timeline of exactly how this massive constitutional crisis originally ignited behind the towering stone walls of the British monarchy, the shocking fact that it ultimately ended with Camilla being coldly informed that she is now essentially nothing more than a high-ranking temporary guest in every single grand palace she genuinely thought she had successfully conquered is actually the least surprising part of this entire explosive saga. Before we dive deeply into the incredibly tense, disastrous private family dinner that officially lit the fuse on this historically unprecedented situation, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe to Monarch Access so you never miss out when we break down massive institutional shifts exactly like this one, because the granular, behind-the-scenes details here are genuinely wild and reveal a completely different side of the royal family. The specific, earth-shattering moment that truly breaks this entire scandal wide open happens inside a highly secured private meeting room deep within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, where Camilla is sitting rigidly at a polished mahogany table, already visibly reeling and completely shell-shocked because a senior private secretary has just finished reading aloud the unyielding contents of a highly classified, legally binding sealed decree that the late Prince Philip deliberately left behind before his death. The incredibly harsh, uncompromising words echoing through that silent room function basically as a brutal constitutional eviction notice delivered from beyond the grave, proving that we are absolutely not talking about a minor, forgettable domestic squabble over which royal relative gets to occupy which luxurious guest wing during the holidays. The devastating decree explicitly and categorically states that as a royal consort who sits entirely outside the direct, unbroken bloodline of succession, Camilla cannot ever legally claim permanent private quarters, establish independent household authority, or wield any form of executive administrative control inside any principal crown residence across the United Kingdom, meaning that Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, and every single one of the institutions defining historical estates have been purposefully, permanently placed completely beyond her reach, not just temporarily sidelined for a season of renovation, but permanently, legally locked away from her grasp. According to the strict parameters of Philip's final directive, she is permitted to visit these grand estates only when official state duty strictly requires her presence, and she may proudly attend massive national ceremonies wearing the crown, but she can absolutely never independently appoint her own loyal staff to manage those sacred spaces. She can never aggressively redesign the historic private quarters to suit her own personal aristocratic tastes. And most devastatingly of all, she can never ever treat those ancient stone walls as her own permanent personal home. The heavy gilded doors of the monarchy haven't just been politely closed in her face, they have been deliberately, systematically locked with deadbolts of constitutional law. And the golden keys are currently being held tightly by people who are absolutely not her fiercely devoted husband. What makes this situation exponentially bigger, more dangerous, and vastly more historically significant than a simple, bitter family argument is the sheer, unstoppable legal machinery aggressively operating behind it. Because a massive portion of the general public simply assumes that if you manage to marry the reigning king, you automatically, by default, get the right to live permanently in the grand palaces and run your own sprawling independent household within their walls. However, principal crown residences are fundamentally not private personal property that can be gifted on a whim. They are sacred national assets held in a strict, unbreakable legal trust for the institution itself, carefully preserved and maintained solely for the absolute continuity of the British monarchy across generations. The reigning monarch, no matter how powerful or how deeply in love he may be, simply cannot legally or ethically hand over historic sovereign apartments or grant sweeping administrative authority to his spouse out of pure, unchecked personal affection, because the properties fundamentally belong to something vastly larger, older, and more important than any single temporary reign. Prince Philip, a man who sacrificed his own name, his naval career, and his entire personal independence for the survival of the crown, understood that critical, constitutional distinction vastly better than almost anyone else walking the halls of Buckingham Palace. So when the Duke of Edinburgh sat down to meticulously draft this uncompromising decree, He wasn't just being arbitrarily difficult, vindictive, or overly protective of archaic royal tradition in some vague, abstract way. He was actively, intentionally creating an immovable, impenetrable legal wall between Camilla and the physical, historical centers of supreme royal power. Furthermore, he executed this ruthless administrative maneuver knowing full well that someday in the not-so-distant future, his own eldest son would be the exact person violently forced to enforce its crushing parameters against the very woman he loved. The sheer psychological and emotional weight of that specific, crushing realization inside the Windsor meeting room is almost impossible to overstate for anyone who understands Camilla's history. This is a woman who spent 50 grueling years expertly navigating horrific public hostility, enduring vicious, relentless tabloid cruelty, and surviving the long, inescapable, deeply adored shadow of Princess Diana, just to finally reach the absolute undisputed pinnacle of the British establishment. She endured being called absolutely every terrible name imaginable by the press. She patiently waited out decades of earth-shattering public scandal. She absorbed the hatred of a nation, and she finally triumphantly stood directly beside King Charles at his televised coronation, officially crowned as Queen Consort while the world watched. And yet, in a single devastating afternoon, a nervous private secretary reading from a dead man's classified papers formally informed her that her actual tangible status inside the very palaces she genuinely thought she had, finally rightfully earned, is functionally equivalent to that of a distinguished temporary visitor who must always politely ask permission just to belong. You can vividly see the sheer disbelief in the way she reportedly pulls the heavy watermarked papers across the table toward herself, fiercely demanding to read the harsh, unforgiving words with her own eyes to ensure she isn't being lied to. You can hear the profound betrayal in the desperate, agonizing question she instantly asks, a question that hangs heavily in the stifling air of the room, completely unanswered. Exactly how long had Charles known this devastating trap was coming for her? The king's agonizing, paralyzed silence in that specific, heartbreaking moment tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the current balance of power within the monarchy, because he realizes he cannot rescue her. Even possessing the supreme authority of the sovereign, he finds himself totally, legally bound by the incredibly strict, uncompromising conditions his late father purposefully left behind. And actively challenging those conditions would mean declaring an open, catastrophic constitutional war on the senior royal trustees, the government advisors, and the elite legal guardians who have been formally empowered to ruthlessly enforce the decree. Charles's profound, lifelong romantic love and his heavy, inherited institutional duty are suddenly locked in a direct, inescapable, violent conflict, and for the very first time in his entire reign, the cold machinery of duty is undeniably winning with absolute, terrifying finality. But to truly deeply understand exactly why Prince Philip ultimately went to such extraordinary, unprecedented legal lengths to secure the future of the crown, you have to rewind the timeline and go completely back to the specific disastrous night this entire constitutional crisis originally started. Because this sweeping decree absolutely wasn't born from some sudden, abstract philosophical concern about the nuances of constitutional governance or estate management. It was born directly at a highly private, incredibly tense family dinner at Windsor Castle that went so spectacularly, catastrophically off the rails that Philip physically walked away from the table entirely convinced that Camilla posed an active, existential threat to the long-term survival of the monarchy itself. Up until that fateful, bitterly contested evening, Philip had largely, albeit grudgingly, accepted Camilla as the steadfast, long-suffering partner of his eldest son, having watched the messy, highly publicized romantic drama play out for half a century, and having slowly made his cautious peace with her permanent presence as an unavoidable, inevitable reality of Charles's complicated life and eventual reign. But the conversation that unfolded at that specific dinner completely, irrevocably changed everything in Philip's mind. Months before this disastrous family gathering took place, the senior palace administration and the highest-ranking courtiers had quietly, methodically begun their necessary internal discussions regarding future succession planning. They weren't focused on the grand, glittering ceremonial stuff the public eagerly watches on television, but rather they were engaging in the deeply unglamorous, highly secretive, vital bureaucratic work of strictly figuring out exactly who would administratively control which historic apartments, which sprawling administrative offices, which luxurious guest wings, and which elite household staff once the massive, complex transition from Queen Elizabeth's reign to Charles's reign began in earnest. These intense, closed-door logistical meetings might easily sound like incredibly boring, mundane real estate management to the outside world, but within the fiercely competitive walls of the monarchy, they are actually entirely about raw, unfiltered power. Whoever legally and physically controls the private rooms, corridors, and antechambers immediately surrounding a reigning monarch completely controls the flow of access, dictating exactly who gets to have a quiet, influential word before a massive state decision is made, which specific loyal staff members are strategically promoted, which extended family members are granted the valuable ear of the sovereign, and which direct heirs to the throne are either fully empowered to lead or quietly, maliciously sidelined into irrelevance. Prince Philip, a brilliant battle-tested institutional strategist, knew this harsh reality with absolute terrifying clarity. During the dinner, a senior palace official cautiously presented a comprehensive, long-term operational proposal that explicitly and permanently reserved a major, incredibly historic, highly secured apartment suite within the heart of Windsor Castle specifically for Prince William, Princess Catherine, and their 3 young children. The institutional logic behind the proposal was entirely straightforward, legally sound, and strategically necessary. As the direct biological heirs to the British throne, the Wales family desperately needed absolute, secure, permanent residential footing deeply within the principal royal residences in order to adequately prepare for their massively expanded constitutional roles, their increased security needs, and their future reign. Before absolutely anyone else sitting at the elegant table could even begin to intellectually process the deep strategic significance of the official proposal, Camilla reportedly challenged it directly, loudly, and without hesitation. She aggressively argued that the permanent reservation of such a massive suite was entirely premature, firmly asserting that the next reigning sovereign should possess the absolute, unencumbered freedom to decide such vital domestic and administrative matters only after Charles had fully, officially assumed the throne and the dust had settled. She further argued passionately that Charles had already sacrificed more than enough of his own personal happiness, freedom, and domestic peace throughout his incredibly difficult life without being unfairly shackled by preemptive, restrictive residential arrangements heavily engineered by the previous generation's courtiers. She brilliantly attempted to frame her vehement objection as an act of fierce, unwavering loyalty to her husband, positioning herself as the devoted wife protecting him from cynical bureaucratic overreach and palace micromanagement. But her carefully chosen words landed with a chilling, horrifying effect across that long, candlelit mahogany table. Prince Philip slowly, deliberately set down his crystal glass with a calculated, terrifying slowness that instantly made the atmosphere in the entire dining room go ice cold, the silence suddenly deafening. He leaned his imposing frame forward, locking eyes with his son's partner, and asked a single, devastatingly sharp question that effortlessly cut straight through every single layer of polite diplomatic phrasing. Did she genuinely, truly consider the direct, biological heirs to the British throne to be mere, temporary guests inside their own ancestral historical inheritance? The suffocating silence that immediately followed his question was absolutely crushing. Heavy with the sudden realization of the boundary she had just crossed, Camilla frantically tried to defend her vulnerable position, insisting once again with rising panic that Charles fundamentally deserved total domestic autonomy and peace after enduring decades of public suffering and media torment. But when thrown violently against the towering, unyielding wall of absolute institutional continuity that Prince Philip physically and morally represented, her emotional, husband-centric words sounded incredibly hollow, selfish, and dangerously short-sighted. And then, something incredibly subtle happened that I think gets vastly overlooked in a lot of the dramatic tabloid retellings of this specific story, but it actually perfectly explains so much of the ruthless legal action that came later. Princess Catherine, who had been sitting absolutely quietly, perfectly composed, and silently observing throughout the entire incredibly tense exchange, slowly, deliberately moved her heavy dining chair just a microscopic fraction of an inch away from the table. It was a tiny, subtle, almost involuntary physical reaction to the hostility, but in the highly coded, hyper-observant world of royal body language, it carried immense, unmistakable psychological weight, signaling that she had just heard the foundational, secure home of her own children's future casually reduced to disposable, negotiable political territory, being actively bartered away by an incredibly ambitious royal consort. Prince William noticed his wife's subtle movement immediately, his protective instincts instantly flaring to life. He glanced sharply at Catherine and then slowly, deliberately lowered his furious gaze to the polished surface of the table, visibly, heavily suppressing his boiling anger, using every ounce of his royal training to prevent the formal dinner from spectacularly exploding into an open, catastrophic, screaming confrontation between his father's new, controversial marriage and his own young family's absolute non-negotiable security. That tiny, almost imperceptible, highly charged glance shared between William and Catherine was the exact defining moment Prince Philip realized with terrifying clarity that the ongoing dispute was absolutely no longer just a petty argument about historic bedrooms, silk curtains, or castle floor plans. It had rapidly escalated into a massive, fundamental existential battle over whether the physical, administrative, and psychological security of the next generation of direct heirs could ever be made dangerously, unacceptably dependent on the personal approval, shifting whims, or changing unpredictable moods of a royal consort who sat entirely outside the direct sacred bloodline. Later that exact same night, driven by a fierce protective urgency that completely superseded any lingering personal affection or desire for family peace, Philip immediately summoned one of his absolute most trusted elite private secretaries to his private study. Operating entirely behind closed, locked doors and deeply within the strict, impenetrable confidentiality of his personal sovereign papers, he methodically, ruthlessly dictated the foundational, unbreakable clauses of what would eventually become the legendary secret decree. He explicitly, legally commanded that no royal consort who exists outside the direct line of succession could ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, be permitted to displace, diminish, override, or place conditional restrictions upon the permanent residential, administrative, and constitutional standing of a direct heir to the throne. He incredibly carefully, legally defined the role of a royal consort as a spouse possessing great, undeniable ceremonial power, historical importance, and massive public respect, yet purposefully remaining fundamentally, structurally outside the unbroken sacred bloodline that actually inherits the immortal crown itself. What had originally begun just hours earlier as a highly localized, bitter disagreement over a single historic apartment suite at Windsor Castle had rapidly, aggressively expanded under Philip's relentless, protective hand into an absolute ironclad nationwide restriction covering every single principal crown residence across the entirety of the United Kingdom. And Philip absolutely didn't stop his crusade there. Knowing that paperwork alone could not stop a determined king, he subsequently confronted King Charles directly in a highly classified, recorded private exchange, forcefully demanding to know whether his eldest son would actually possess the necessary political strength, the institutional fortitude, and the moral courage to fiercely protect William's household and future inheritance, if Camilla ever aggressively demanded greater residential and administrative control once they finally occupied the throne. Charles, ever the diplomat attempting to pacify two warring sides of his heart, answered carefully that once he became king, he simply could not allow old, archaic family fears and historic, unfounded paranoia to rigidly govern the daily lived reality of his marriage and his court. But beneath those seemingly reasonable diplomatic words, Philip's highly trained ear heard something entirely chilling and completely, constitutionally unacceptable, the unmistakable, terrifying admission that Charles's intense, personal romantic devotion might ultimately, disastrously override his sacred constitutional duty when intense emotional pressure mounted behind the palace walls. Realizing with absolute horrifying certainty that his son's institutional judgment was fatally, permanently compromised by a lifetime of deep emotional devotion to one woman, Philip immediately took matters forcefully into his own hands. Before dawn even broke over the rolling Berkshire countryside, he proactively widened the geographic and administrative scope of the sweeping restriction, brilliantly transforming a targeted, localized internal memo into a massive, comprehensive, legally binding decree that fully encompassed every single major royal residence in the country. He established an unbreakable, multi-layered chain of elite legal guardians. He instituted binding, unyielding administrative protocols, and he drafted rigorous, airtight succession safeguards entirely designed to withstand intense personal pressure, massive political lobbying, and severe emotional manipulation, deliberately ensuring the document would hold firm, even if those intense pressures were aggressively applied by a reigning monarch at the absolute height of his sovereign power. So, when we finally jump forward in the timeline to that fateful, devastating meeting at Windsor Castle, where the hidden decree is finally, shockingly activated against her, the true, crushing weight of exactly what Prince Philip built in the dark becomes absolutely impossible to ignore. Princess Anne enters the quiet meeting room entirely without knocking, completely without offering any polite ceremonial greeting to acknowledge the tense, suffocating atmosphere, fully embodying the ruthless efficiency of the institution she serves. She walks directly, purposefully, to the polished mahogany table and places a heavy black leather archival case squarely in the dead center, deliberately keeping one gloved hand resting firmly, possessively upon its lid. That singular, silent physical gesture communicates vastly more than any spoken threat or shouted argument ever could, instantly signaling that the classified documents locked inside are absolutely not theoretical arguments, polite suggestions, or distant, ignorable memories of a dead man. They are highly active, legally binding, weaponized instruments of statecraft, and Princess Anne is standing there tall and unyielding as one of the explicitly designated sworn enforcers of an ironclad institutional mandate that absolutely cannot be bypassed, casually negotiated away, or dissolved by a simple royal decree from her brother. Camilla immediately, fiercely directs her sharpest, most furious gaze toward the Princess Royal, her shaking voice carrying heavy fragments of deeply wounded authority, as she loudly declares that the hidden decree is fundamentally unjust, historically unprecedented, and will inevitably swiftly be overturned through the formal legal channels of the Royal Household Property Council the second Charles gives the order. Anne doesn't even raise her voice a fraction of an inch, and she completely refuses to engage in a heated emotional debate, possessing a chilling, terrifying calmness as she simply states that her brilliant father actively anticipated those exact, defensive words long before his passing, and he meticulously, brilliantly prepared every single legal safeguard necessary to flawlessly withstand absolutely any challenge Camilla could possibly attempt to mount. She calmly explains to the horrified queen consort that before Philip died, she willingly accepted the solemn, heavy burden of acting as the primary, unyielding guardian of the decree, making it explicitly clear that this role is absolutely not a fun privilege or a hollow ceremonial title. It is an unbreakable, sacred constitutional duty explicitly entrusted to her to permanently ensure that deep personal affection, intense political pressure, and private domestic bargaining can never ever be allowed to weaken the protective historical framework surrounding the direct line of succession. And then, before Camilla can even begin to process the finality of that statement, the second, far more devastating shockwave violently hits the room, as Anne slowly reaches into the black archival case and withdraws a second, thicker set of legal documents, revealing the precise, brilliant mechanisms that permanently bind the future of the monarchy. Beneath Princess Anne's own bold signature on the foundational guardianship papers rests the unmistakable, undeniable signature of Prince William himself. The incredibly popular future king is absolutely not merely a passive observer casually invited to witness a messy family dispute or offer sympathetic, useless counsel to his stepmother. He has been deliberately, strategically placed directly inside the administrative, legal machinery of enforcement. His explicit, written signature and formal approval is legally, permanently required before Camilla can ever receive even a single permanent private suite, an independent administrative office, or a lasting residential foothold inside absolutely any principal crown property across the entire realm. The long-term implications of this revelation are absolutely staggering, completely shifting the balance of power in an instant. Camilla desperately looks across the massive table toward her husband, but King Charles can offer her absolutely no comfort or rescue because the reigning monarch instantly, painfully understands that his own eldest son has been brilliantly, legally positioned as an unmovable, impenetrable shield actively protecting the long-term historical integrity of the crown against the massive personal ambitions of the reigning consort. Camilla hastily, frantically turns the crisp pages of the supporting legal schedules, her eyes frantically searching through the dense, archaic legal clauses and complex administrative addendums for a single tiny procedural loophole or structural weakness that could possibly invalidate the crushing restrictions placed upon her. Instead of finding a miraculous way out of the trap, she discovers something far more personal and vastly more devastating to her ego. Across multiple highly protected residential clauses distributed throughout the entire national portfolio of royal estates, the name of Catherine, Princess of Wales, is repeatedly, explicitly invoked with absolute terrifying strategic precision. The rapidly emerging pattern in the paperwork is entirely impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Prince Philip's ruthless decree was absolutely never drafted merely as a defensive, petty measure, just to keep one specific, disliked woman out of a set of historic bedrooms. It was actively engineered with brilliant, surgical foresight to permanently secure Catherine's residential future, cement her institutional authority, and guarantee her physical security years, if not decades, before absolutely anyone in the palace could ever mount a successful, coordinated challenge against her rise to power. The deeper foundational reasons for this incredibly specific legal protection connect directly, inextricably back to the unspoken, lingering fallout from that bitter, tense evening at the Windsor dinner table, when Catherine subtly moved her chair a fraction of an inch, and Prince Philip brilliantly, terrifyingly saw the entire vulnerable future of the monarchy flash before his incredibly sharp eyes. The brutal realization of this fact triggers a profound, devastating psychological shift inside the stifling meeting room. Camilla understands with blinding, agonizing clarity that her decades of silently enduring horrific public hostility, expertly managing endless media scandals, and tirelessly fighting for basic social acceptance have culminated in the most bitter, cruel irony imaginable. It was a tiny, subtle, almost involuntary physical reaction to the hostility, but in the highly coded, hyper-observant world of royal body language, it carried immense, unmistakable psychological weight, signaling that she had just heard the foundational, secure home of her own children's future casually reduced to disposable, negotiable political territory, being actively bartered away by an incredibly ambitious royal consort. Prince William noticed his wife's subtle movement immediately, his protective instincts instantly flaring to life. He glanced sharply at Catherine and then slowly, deliberately lowered his furious gaze to the polished surface of the table, visibly, heavily suppressing his boiling anger, using every ounce of his royal training to prevent the formal dinner from spectacularly exploding into an open, catastrophic, screaming confrontation between his father's new, controversial marriage and his own young family's absolute non-negotiable security. That tiny, almost imperceptible, highly charged glance shared between William and Catherine was the exact defining moment Prince Philip realized with terrifying clarity that the ongoing dispute was absolutely no longer just a petty argument about historic bedrooms, silk curtains, or castle floor plans. It had rapidly escalated into a massive, fundamental existential battle over whether the physical, administrative, and psychological security of the next generation of direct heirs could ever be made dangerously, unacceptably dependent on the personal approval, shifting whims, or changing unpredictable moods of a royal consort who sat entirely outside the direct sacred bloodline.